Imagine taking a walk through a quiet forest. The trees are silent. The only sound is the wind moving through the leaves. Then, hidden beneath the brush, you notice a rusty metal barrel. It looks old, abandoned. Curious, you walk closer. But what was inside that barrel would become one of the darkest mysteries in American history. This story begins on November 10th, 1985, in Bear Brook State Park, New Hampshire. A hunter was exploring a remote part of the forest when he noticed a large steel drum tucked away in the woods. It seemed out of place. Thinking it might contain trash, authorities were called to inspect it. When investigators opened the barrel, they made a horrifying discovery. Inside were the remains of a woman and a young girl. There were no identification cards, no personal belongings, no clues revealing who they were. The victims had been hidden so carefully that investigators believed they had been there for years. Police immediately sealed off the area. Search teams combed the surrounding forest. Detectives questioned local residents and searched missing person records across several states. But nothing matched. No one came forward looking for the woman or the child. It was as if they had vanished from history. The case quickly turned cold. Months turned into years. The barrel remained one of New Hampshire's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Then, 15 years later, investigators returned to the exact same location. They searched only a short distance from where the first barrel had been discovered. What they found left even experienced detectives speechless. Another rusted barrel, hidden in the woods. When it was opened, investigators made an even more shocking discovery. Inside were the remains of two more young girls. Now the mystery had grown even darker. Who were these four victims? Why had they been left in separate barrels? And most importantly, where was the killer? For years, police had almost no answers. But decades later, a revolutionary DNA technique would uncover a truth far stranger than anyone had imagined. The discovery of the second barrel changed everything. Police now knew they weren't investigating the deaths of two people. They were investigating the murders of four victims. Yet they still faced the same problem. No names, no missing person reports that matched, no suspect. Investigators carefully examined the barrels. They searched for fingerprints. They collected every piece of evidence the forest had preserved. But years of rain, snow, and time had erased almost everything. The case seemed impossible. Then detectives noticed something unusual. The woman and the children didn't appear to be strangers. Investigators believed they had likely known each other. But who were they? And why had no one reported them missing? The answers simply didn't exist. As the years passed, forensic artists created facial reconstructions of the victims. The images were released across the United States. Police hoped someone would recognize a face. Thousands of tips arrived. Every lead was investigated. One by one, they all reached dead ends. The mystery became one of New Hampshire's oldest cold cases. Then, decades later, science caught up with the investigation. Advanced DNA testing confirmed something detectives had never expected. The children were not all biologically related in the way investigators had originally assumed. This discovery completely changed the direction of the case. Detectives realized they might not be searching for a single missing family. They might be dealing with something far more complicated. At the same time, investigators began re-examining old records from across the country. One name kept appearing during their search. Or rather, many names. The same man had used different identities in different states. He rented homes under one name, worked under another, introduced himself as someone completely different wherever he went. It was as if he had spent his entire life hiding behind fake identities. Who was this man? Why did he constantly change his name? And could he somehow be connected to the four victims found in the barrels? At first, investigators had only fragments of information. A photograph here, a document there, nothing that proved he was involved. But every new record pointed in the same direction. This mysterious drifter had left a trail across the United States. And wherever he went, people seemed to disappear. Detectives were finally getting close. But they still didn't know his real identity. For years, investigators searched for a man who didn't seem to exist. Every document led to a different name. Every state had a different identity. It was as though someone had erased his real life and replaced it with dozens of fake ones. Then investigators made a breakthrough. Fingerprints taken years earlier from a separate investigation were compared with old records. The results shocked everyone. The mysterious drifter wasn't a man named Curtis. He wasn't Gordon, and he wasn't any of the other names he had used. His real name was Terry Peder Rasmussen, but identifying him only created more questions. Who was Terry Rasmussen? As detectives dug deeper into his past, they found a disturbing pattern. He rarely stayed in one place for long. He moved from state to state. He changed jobs frequently. He introduced himself with new names wherever he went. And every time he disappeared, someone else seemed to disappear too. Investigators began contacting police departments across the country. Old missing person files were reopened. Unsolved homicide cases were reviewed. Slowly, Rasmussen's past began to emerge. Years before the Bear Brook investigation, he had been questioned in other suspicious cases. He had lived with different women. He had traveled with children who were never properly identified. But because he constantly changed his identity, no one realized they were dealing with the same man. It was like assembling a massive jigsaw puzzle with pieces scattered across the entire country. Then detectives uncovered another startling fact. Rasmussen had died in prison in 2010 while serving a sentence for an unrelated crime. The prime suspect in the Bear Brook murders was already dead. There would never be an interrogation. No confession. No explanation. If investigators wanted answers, they would have to find them without him. That made one question more important than ever. Who were the woman and 3 little girls found inside the barrels? Without identifying the victims, detectives could never fully understand what had happened. The investigation now shifted away from the killer and toward the victims. Modern DNA technology would soon accomplish something that had once seemed impossible. It would finally give names to people who had been unknown for decades. For more than 30 years, the 4 victims had remained anonymous. Investigators knew almost everything about the crime scene, but they still didn't know the most important thing. Who were they? Traditional investigative methods had failed. Missing person reports produced no answers. Facial reconstructions led nowhere. Every promising lead eventually ended in disappointment. Then, investigators turned to a new technology that had already begun solving impossible cold cases. Genetic genealogy. Instead of searching for an exact DNA match, experts searched for distant relatives who shared small portions of the victim's DNA. It was a slow process. Family trees stretching back generations had to be built. Old birth records, marriage certificates, and census documents were carefully examined. Months of research finally produced the first breakthrough. The adult victim was identified as Marlies Elizabeth Honeychurch. She had disappeared years earlier along with her 2 daughters. The 2 girls found with her were identified as Marie Vaughn and Sarah Lynn McWattis. For investigators, it was an emotional moment. After decades, as Jane does, 3 of the victims finally had their names back. But one mystery remained. The youngest child found in the second barrel was not Marlies' daughter. DNA confirmed she was biologically related to Terry Rasmussen. However, her mother's identity remained unknown. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why had no one ever reported her missing? Detectives searched Rasmussen's past once again. They discovered that he had lived under several false identities while moving across different states. He often appeared with new companions and children, then disappeared before anyone became suspicious. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Investigators now believed there could be other victims who had never been connected to Rasmussen. The Bear Brook case was no longer just one investigation. It had become the key to unlocking several mysteries across the United States. Then another shocking discovery emerged. A young girl who had once traveled with Rasmussen had survived. She had been raised under a false identity and had no idea who she really was. Investigators located her through DNA testing. For the first time in her life, she learned her true biological identity and discovered the horrifying truth about the man she had known. The investigation was still uncovering secrets decades after the murders. But one final question remained unanswered. Who was the little girl in the second barrel? Her identity continued to haunt detectives. Years later, Another DNA breakthrough would finally solve the last piece of the puzzle. For decades, one victim remained a mystery. Investigators knew she was connected to Terry Rasmussen through DNA, but they didn't know her name. Without knowing who her mother was, every lead seemed to end the same way. Then, advances in genetic genealogy opened one final door. Experts compared her DNA with distant relatives from across the United States. Piece by piece, they built another family tree. After years of work, the mystery was finally solved. The little girl was identified as Dawn Rasmussen. She was Terry Rasmussen's biological daughter. Her mother was Evangeline Rasmussen, a woman who had disappeared years earlier after separating from Terry. Although investigators believe Evangeline likely met a tragic fate, her remains have never been found. Even after solving the identities inside the barrels, Rasmussen's crimes continued to raise new questions. As detectives reviewed his past, they discovered a chilling pattern. He entered people's lives with charm. He gained their trust. Then, without warning, they vanished. He changed names so often that different police departments never realized they were dealing with the same man. One state knew him by one identity. Another state knew him by another. By the time investigators connected the dots, decades had already passed. The Bear Brook investigation became one of the first major murder cases in the United States to use genetic genealogy so successfully. What once seemed impossible had become reality. Victims who had spent years without names were finally identified. Families who had lived with unanswered questions finally learned what had happened to their loved ones. But there was one thing investigators would never recover: the killer's explanation. Terry Rasmussen had died in prison years before the Bear Brook case was fully unraveled. There would be no confession, no interview, no chance to ask why. The truth had to be reconstructed from evidence, forensic science, and the lives he left behind. Even today, investigators believe Rasmussen may have committed additional crimes that have never been linked to him. Some disappearances from the 1970s and 1980s remain unsolved. Whether he was responsible is a question that may never be answered. The Bear Brook case remained a mystery for decades. What started with a single barrel in the woods eventually exposed Terry Peder Rasmussen, a man who had spent years hiding behind false identities. Although he died before he could stand trial for these murders, modern DNA and genetic genealogy finally revealed the victims' identities and connected the pieces of the investigation. For the families, the greatest victory wasn't a conviction. It was finally learning the truth. The Bear Brook investigation also changed criminal investigations forever. Its success proved that genetic genealogy could solve cases once thought impossible, leading detectives to reopen countless cold cases across the country. Even today, investigators believe Rasmussen may have had more victims whose stories remain untold. Some secrets may have died with him, but the 4 victims found in the barrels are no longer unknown. They have their names, they have their stories, and they will never be forgotten. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment for more videos.